June 1980, 56-year-old Zigmund Adamski left his home on foot to go and grab some food shopping, and then he just never came home. His body would later be found under absolutely baffling circumstances that to this day, no one has ever been able to make any sense of. The strange situation around Zigmund's death has led to countless theories over the years, none of which quite make sense, but there is one theory that people seem to focus on more than the rest. Alien abduction. If you've been around here for a while, you will know that I am, at heart, a skeptic. I am not one to run with theories of aliens and the supernatural and things like that. But that doesn't mean I won't share them with you, because just because I'm inclined not to believe in things like that, doesn't mean that you guys aren't either. And this is a really interesting case, one that, like I said, has left investigators absolutely baffled. So, Zigmund Adamski was born and raised in Poland, but he was forced to flee his home country during the Second World War. Some sources said that he'd been a prisoner of war in Germany during this time. I'm not entirely sure how true that was. Either way, we know that he escapes and settles in England in the village of Tingley in West Yorkshire. England really quickly became his home. He settled here, he made a good group of friends whom all called him Ziggy, and he was said to be very happy. He took a job as a coal miner, and in 1951 he married a woman called Leocadia, or Lottie as she was known. And then, as the years passed, Lottie started to get ill, and Zigmund was forced to become her full-time carer, which was really hard because he was still working full-time at the colliery as well, and also he wasn't in the best health himself. Sources say that he had a lung deformity that often meant he had difficulty breathing, which I can only imagine was exacerbated by his job down the mines at the Loft House Colliery, which is where he was working at the time. And it seems his doctors agreed with this because at the time of his disappearance, he'd been off work for several months. Although he wasn't exactly relaxing, he had to look after Lottie and just run the household. Things were just really starting to get on top of him, so after many years of hard work, Zigmund had decided it was time to apply for an early retirement. His initial application for this retirement was rejected by the company, but it was soon reviewed, and upon a second look, it was accepted. Not that Zigmund would ever know this though, because the decision arrived by post just the day after he disappeared. On the day that he disappeared, on the 6th of June 1980, Zigmund had had a fairly normal day. He'd been shopping in Wakefield with his cousin and her son who were visiting from Poland, and then they all returned back to his and Lottie's home for fish and chips for dinner. He seemed to be in good enough spirits, he was having a good time with his cousin, and he was also supposed to be giving away his goddaughter at her wedding that very same week. He was really looking forward to it. He'd written a speech, he had plans to be there, he had no plans to disappear. At around 3:30, Zigmund said that he needed to pop to the shop to buy some potatoes, and this is a trip that literally should have taken minutes. The shop was only just down the road, he was going to walk there. He puts on his jacket, which would have had his wallet with some cash in the pocket, and headed out the house. He saw a neighbour as he passed and they did exchange a little bit of small talk, but then he never reached the shop. At some point on this journey, Zigmund just disappeared. If this was a woman, I'd say it was very likely that he got abducted en route, and whilst we obviously can't rule that out, it would be a very strange twist for this case to take. Did Zigmund maybe get distracted on his journey? Did he run into a friend? Did he remember something else that he had to do in a different part of town? Well, no one knows, obviously. It's not clear if he did make it as far as the shop. Some sources say that he did, that he had a chat with the shopkeeper and apparently seemed in good spirits, he seemed chirpy. Other sources say he didn't ever make it that far, but regardless, if he did make it to the shop, the potatoes that he bought there were never found. When Zigmund failed to return home that night, Lottie contacted the Wakefield police to report him as missing. I couldn't really find much information out about the police response to all this. In all honesty, this is kind of one of those cases that's fallen subject to the internet. There's one or two proper primary sources, and the rest just seems to be blog posts and podcasts that people have made based on those sources. And every single one has a slightly different narrative. There's not loads of detail available here, so let's hope that the police did do a search for him immediately. And it does seem at the very least like the local newspapers did cover his disappearance. They did do appeals for him. But this search didn't have to go on for long because just 5 days after Zigmund went missing, he was found. It was 3:45 p.m. on Wednesday the 11th of June 1980 when a man called Trevor Parker arrived at his father's coal yard in Todmorden, which is only a few miles from where Zigmund had gone missing. He spotted something kind of strange on top of a pile of coal in a kind of hollow at the top of the pile. A closer look revealed a body, a man who was very clearly dead. The situation was just baffling. The coal pile was anywhere from 10 to 20 foot high, depending on which source you want to believe, but yet there were no footprints or marks where somebody might have climbed up this. And besides, it's pretty hard to climb a coal pile like this. It had been raining all day, it was very slippery, it's not going to be easy to climb up this. And Trevor also noticed that the clothing on the man was very strange. The man, who would obviously later turn out to be Zigmund, was wearing his jacket, but there was no shirt, and no shirt has ever been found either. Neither has Zigmund's watch, driving license, wallet, or money. This whole situation was incredibly weird. Poor Trevor couldn't make any sense of what he was seeing. Of course, Trevor quickly contacts the police, and less than half an hour later, 2 local police officers turn up, and they are Mervyn Haig and Alan Godfrey. Just like Trevor, they are baffled by what they're seeing, and they also notice a strange mark on the back of the dead man's head, neck and shoulder. It kinda looked like a burn, but also not really. And on top of the mark, there was some sort of ointment that couldn't be identified, but we'll circle back round to that in a bit. The body was transferred to the mortuary in Hebden Bridge, and that night a post-mortem was conducted whilst officers went out in search of this man's identity. It didn't take long for them to connect the dots and confirm him as Zigmund Adamski. Lottie sent a family friend called Chris to identify him. This post-mortem noted many things. It estimated that Zigmund had died around 8 to 10 hours beforehand, which puts his time of death around midday that very same day. But Zigmund had been missing for 5 whole days, so where had he been in this time? Bar the strange burn marks, they found no obvious physical injuries on his body. They found no internal injuries. He hadn't been beaten or assaulted at all, although there were some cuts and scrapes on his thighs, hands and knees. But the burn marks were definitely the strangest thing here. They have been described as oval-shaped on the left of his neck and below the ear. There had been a slight loss of skin and brown discoloration, and I do find myself wondering about the exact size of these marks. The oval shape makes me wonder if maybe they could have been potentially burn marks from a cigar or cigarette, or if they were larger, I don't know. But small oval-shaped marks, that does suggest cigarette, doesn't it? But I don't know how big they were. But the doctor personally thought that they looked like some sort of burn from a corrosive substance, and apparently they would have happened a couple of days before his death. The injuries were about 48 hours old, so they would have happened in that 5 days that he'd gone missing. And strangely again, somebody had clearly made some effort to help heal these marks with the strange ointment put over the top. Again, I have so many questions about this because what do they mean by strange? In my head, I'm picturing some sort of Vaseline type consistency. So could this have just been Vaseline or another burn ointment from the pharmacy? Would they have actually had the technology to test exactly what this was back in 1980? I assume maybe they would have done. But what do they mean by strange ointment? Was it something homemade? Was it something extraterrestrial maybe? I don't know. But what this ointment does suggest is that Zigmund or somebody else had noted the burns and they were making effort to heal them. In the end, the medical examiner just put Zigmund's cause of death down to simply a heart attack. It was put down to natural causes. He had clearly been ill for quite a while, he had signs of heart disease, and despite the very odd circumstances of his body being found on top of a pile of coal, he had died naturally. And again, this raises so many questions, because did he choose to climb to the top of the coal pile himself and then just so happened to die? Natural causes suggest that somebody else didn't put him on this coal pile, that nobody else was complicit in his death. And besides, it would have been very, very difficult for somebody to carry a dead body up to the top of this pile. As I said earlier, it was wet, it was slippery, it would have been pretty hard to scale. Not impossible, but not easy by any means. And for somebody else to carry another human being up there, it's just not really feasible. And believe it or not, we've only scraped the surface of weird in this case. Although Zigmund had been missing for 5 days, his face only showed 1 day's growth of stubble, suggesting that he had been shaving in the days that he'd been gone. Now, he certainly hadn't taken a razor with him, so where and how was he shaving? Alongside this, his hair had also been cut short in a roughly cut manner, which was very unlike Zigmund. It seems like he was always quite a well put together guy, so this crude haircut was very unusual for him. Yeah, I told you, this case is so strange. In all of the decades since, no one's ever been able to find any answers as to where Zigmund was for those 5 days, nor any answers as to why he climbed to the top of a coal pile and died. One big question in this case is always, what time did Zigmund turn up at this coal yard? And was there any link between the fact that he was a coal miner himself and this is where he died? Now, I'm about 99% sure that the colliery where he was found was not the one that he worked at, so that wasn't the connection. In putting together a timeline of this day, PC Alan Godfrey, one of the first officers to respond to the scene, spoke to a man called Peter Sutcliffe. No, not that Peter Sutcliffe. This one was a part-time worker at the coal station. Sutcliffe said that he'd been there between 1pm and 1:30pm that day. He'd gone to the yard specifically looking for Trevor Parker but couldn't find him, and so instead went down to the local pub where he did find him. Trevor said that he'd been at the coal yard first thing that morning and he also hadn't spotted anything. He didn't return to the yard until 3pm after chatting with Peter down the pub. With the post-mortem saying that Zigmund died around midday, either Peter simply didn't see the body when he was there at midday, which may have been possible, or somebody else placed his body there after 1:30pm. Or the post-mortem is mistaken and Zigmund died later. It's also worth noting that there was a train station and a railway line that ran next to the coal yard, which was kind of like slightly raised upwards, and passengers on both the trains and at the station probably would have been able to see a body lying there, but no reports of this ever came in, which does suggest that Zigmund wasn't there for all that long. So this whole situation, very, very strange, but then it came out that Zigmund had died of natural causes. This was not criminal, it wasn't a matter for the police as far as Alan's superiors were concerned. Yes, it was strange, it was weird, but no crime had been committed. But by this point, Alan had formed a very close relationship with Lottie, and as you can imagine, she was absolutely devastated by her husband's death. She just wanted to find answers. Alan wanted to find answers for Lottie. She thought that her husband had been kidnapped, and honestly, who can blame her for thinking so? He'd been shaved, he had those strange burn marks, his hair had been cut. It was one of the only theories that made any sense. Alan wanted to find the answers for Lottie, but he was repeatedly told no by the people above him. This wasn't a criminal matter. Zigmund had died from natural causes. We have also got to think about the fact, though, that Zigmund might have chosen to leave of his own accord. Perhaps everything just got on top of him. The stress of caring for his wife, the fact that his early retirement had been rejected, maybe he just decided to leave. We don't know the state of Zigmund's brain at this time. Lottie is so sure that he never would have done such a thing, but it can't be ruled out as a possibility. It could also have been that Zigmund had a mental break. Perhaps he went out for his walk, maybe he fell and hit his head, which caused something to snap. Maybe he had amnesia and just wandered off, wandering around the city for a few days. This doesn't really explain how he was able to shave, why his hair was cut, but I'm sure it wouldn't have been that hard to find a way to do so. Some sort of mental emergency could also explain why he died where he did. Perhaps he was in distress, just wandering around, saw coal, and it felt like a safe space. I am well aware of how odd that sounds, but he'd worked as a coal miner for a really long time. It was all he knew. In the September, it was reported that the coroner had concluded an inquest into the case, and they had recorded an open verdict on Zigmund's death. Basically, they weren't able to find any answers as to the circumstances of his death, but he had died of natural causes. But strangely, neither Alan Godfrey nor the other officer who had first attended the scene had been called as witnesses at this inquest. Alan was told that he wasn't needed after inquiring as to why, but this just didn't really sit right with him. It felt like they were trying to cover something up. Alan had been repeatedly told that this case wasn't a police matter, but now the inquest had found otherwise and he was being left in the dark. Answers still needed to be found. The inquest ultimately found that Zigmund was clean and well cared for when he died. It didn't seem like he'd been living rough in those 5 days. He hadn't eaten on the day that he died, so he hadn't really had any breakfast, and his cause of death was indeed a heart attack. It was heart failure brought on by an underlying heart disease. What had caused it to come to head at this exact moment? Well, no one knows, but it has been suggested that he could have been under excess stress or maybe was scared. I mentioned a possible mental break earlier, but there was no evidence of any brain injury that pointed in this direction, although it doesn't always have to be caused by an injury to the brain, of course. Something which has been mentioned time and time again in sources for this case says that when Zigmund was found, he had a shocked look on his face. Lottie would state at the inquest that she thought it looked like somebody had scared her husband to death, and then somebody had dumped him at the top of the coal pile. Could somebody being scared really be enough to cause a heart attack? Well, yeah, it happens all the time, especially in people that do have underlying heart problems. The coroner stated at this inquest that the police should not leave a single stone unturned in this case, saying that whatever can be done will be done. I shall see to that. And I can imagine this was wildly frustrating for Alan Godfrey to be reading about in the newspaper. No one at the station had even told him this inquest was taking place. He had to find out about it at the same time as the general public. He had been fighting for Lottie, fighting for Zigmund for months to do an actual police investigation, and he'd been being told no, time and time again. And now the coroner was saying, yeah, they should probably do an investigation into this. Now that was all just the first inquest though. A second one did take place pretty soon after, but nothing more could be ascertained from this one either. The final session of this inquest concluded at the end of September 1980, and the coroner had to admit that at this stage there was nothing more he could do. He said that this case was by no means closed, but there was nowhere else to look, and it was one of the most puzzling cases he'd ever come across in his 25-year career. Once again, it was an open verdict, and still today, 44 years later, if my maths is correct, there are still no answers. But this story doesn't end here, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, a lot of people talk about aliens and alien abductions in relation to this case. I mean, if you were to believe in something like that, it certainly could explain a lot about this case, the least of which being the very shocked look on Zigmund's face. But how did such a theory ever come about? Because you could put down any missing persons case or any unusual death as an alien abduction and just draw a line under it. So what makes Zigmund's case here, like one in particular, that people are like aliens? Well, the connection comes thanks to none other than PC Alan Godfrey himself. We need to jump forward a couple of months to this, to the 28th November 1980. Alan had responded to reports of cows or cattle wandering around the Ashenhurst Council estate in Todmorden. Apparently a few of these very baffling reports had come in, and Alan had trawled around this area several times trying to find the cows, but he never saw a single one. At 5 a.m, he was driving up the road when he spotted an object in front of him, something that seemed to be completely blocking the road. He got closer and closer to it, describing the object as diamond-shaped, hovering about 5 foot off the ground, 20 foot wide and 14 foot high. The bottom half was just spinning. He said it was unlike anything he'd ever seen, and then he noticed that his police radio had stopped working. Frantically, he grabs a notepad and starts to make a drawing of this object. And then when he looked up after finishing the drawing, he realised that inexplicably half an hour had passed. It was now 5:30 a.m. and he had no idea where that half an hour had gone. It was literally as if he'd blinked and lost 30 minutes. And not only that, he also realised that in that blink, his left boot had somehow split and he now had an itchy red mark on his foot that he just simply couldn't explain. He knew that something very strange had happened. But he did still have a shift to finish. Alan and another officer, PC Malcolm Agley, would later discover the cows on Central Vale Park. They shouldn't have been in there, but the gates were locked behind them and there were no signs as to how they got in there. It was a very wet night, the grass was all muddy, there should have been hoof prints showing sort of their journey into this park. But there was absolutely nothing. This whole night was just so bizarre. In his search for answers, Alan would later undergo hypnosis, and he recalled how a beam of light blinded him and made him pass out. He remembered waking up inside a room being medically examined by small beings and a humanoid. Now, he has said in the years since this, although that is what he recalled during the hypnosis session, it's not what he genuinely believes happened. He said this may well have been a dream. But do you expect the British tabloid papers to get hold of such a story and run it sensibly? Absolutely not, of course. The papers got a hold of this, and Alan became the subject of national ridicule. He says that he does believe that he saw the UFO in the road, like he can't deny that to himself, but the actual abduction, perhaps just an overactive imagination during hypnosis session. So Alan just doesn't really believe that part of the story, but the tabloid papers could not be told otherwise. Alan said that because of all this, he was hounded out of the police force. He had to take an early retirement, and it's impacted his life in not great ways. He said to the Manchester Evening News, "I wish I'd never seen the UFO, particularly because of the effects on my children. It's not easy having a policeman as a father, but when he's a policeman who saw a UFO, it's even worse." Alan doesn't have the answers as to what happened that night. He just knows that something strange happened. With his potential UFO abduction and Zigmund's case, very strange case, happening both in Todmorden, the area has earned a reputation as being a UFO sighting hotspot. I mean, now a UFO society meets often in the town's Golden Lion pub, and hundreds more sightings have been reported since 1980. Now, do I believe that aliens had something to do with Zigmund Adamski's death? Not at all, but as I said at the very beginning, I am a skeptic at heart. But I don't have any actual answers for you in this case. This is confusing beginning to end, and there's no theory that makes perfect sense. If I had to guess, I'd say I'm leaning towards Zigmund having had some sort of mental break, but I'm not entirely committed to that. All I know is that I don't believe he was abducted by aliens who then burnt him and then left a weird ointment on his back and then placed him at the top of this coal pile. I don't entirely believe in that. And I'm not saying I don't believe in aliens. Like, I do believe there are creatures, things, organisms that exist on other planets in the universe. Like, I think you'd be crazy not to believe that there is life outside of Earth. I just don't believe in, like, the green aliens coming down to Earth in a spaceship and, like, picking humans up and then testing on them and doing all that. That's what I don't believe. At least not in, like, the traditional sense of the beam of light dragging a human up to a spaceship. Like, I just can't. I can't. This is a case that I can't believe I haven't covered before, because there is just no reasonable explanation as to this. Like, this is really and truly a mystery. There's no answers. There probably never will be any answers in this case. I can't imagine anyone coming forward with the conclusion at this point. I mean, even the police, they never really did a proper investigation because it was natural causes. He did die of a heart attack. There was no cuts and bruises. He hadn't been beaten or assaulted. There was no internal injuries. He died naturally, just in a very weird circumstance. But I am going to be absolutely fascinated to hear all of your thoughts and theories in the comments section. What do you think happened to Zigmund Adamski? And do you believe in aliens? Do you think that Alan Godfrey really was abducted that night? Even he doesn't believe it, but I'm intrigued to know if you do. Thank you so much for tuning in today. As always, if you like what I'm doing here on my channel, then please show your support in any way you can. Like this video, leave a comment down below, subscribe to my channel if you're not already. I do see all of you who are not subscribed. I can see the amount of you there are, and there are a lot of you who come back every week and watch the videos. Why aren't you clicking subscribe? You should do that. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.